Hello and welcome to our game theory presentation. Our main aim is to apply the basics of game theory and the payoff matrix to the two main superpowers that ruled during the Cold War era, which were the United States and the Soviet Union. Before moving forward, I'd like to say that our group is made up of Marta Enríquez, Marta Jiménez and Arias. We'll start off by giving a brief context on the Cold War. We can define the Cold War as the open yet restricted rivalry that developed after World War II between the United States and the Soviet Union, as well as their respective allies. The term was first used by the English writer George Orwell in an article published in 1945 to refer to what he predicted would be a nuclear stalemate between two or three monstrous superstates, each who possessed weapons that could wipe out millions of people in a matter of seconds. The Cold War was solidified by 1947 or 48 when the US had brought certain Western countries under American influence and the Soviets had established openly communist regimes. Nevertheless, there was very little use of weapons or battlefields during the Cold War. It was waged mainly on political, economic and propaganda fronts that lasted until 1991. There are a few assumptions in this game. First of all, we're going to assume that both players are rational. This means that each player knows that the other player will choose his or her best option. Secondly, the information that each player has is completely symmetrical. They both know each strategy and their respective benefits. Lastly, the game is simultaneous. So when players make their choices, they do it at the same time without knowing what the opponent has chosen. Now we're going to analyse the pros and cons for each player and strategy. We're going to start off with the pros. For the United States, it would make the imperialist ambitions of the USSR come to a halt in Eastern Europe. It would also prevent China, North Korea and other allies of the communist state of gaining further power within the international system. For the Soviet Union, the advantages of using nuclear weapons would be the withdrawal of US military forces from East Asia. When it comes to the cons, it would be unwise for the US to do so, given that polls about the use of nuclear weapons were overruled by those against it. Therefore, putting them to use would mean going against the country's own public opinion and role as a peace leader. Also, the vast amount of sanctions international organisations such as the United Nations would impose would be fatal. For the Soviet Union, due to the low level of economic development the USSR suffered from, the destruction a nuclear attack would cause would be enough to stop their own desire of a nuclear strike. Here are a few more pros and cons that would affect both players. So, the main question in this game is whether each state should or shouldn't use nuclear weapons. To come up with an answer, we now need to take a look at the payoff matrix. Before analysing the payoff matrix, we're going to put forward two definitions. First of all, we say there's a dominant strategy when the player knows without a doubt what the best option is. This means a player will choose said option regardless of what the rival does. On the other hand, a dominated strategy is the worst option for each player, so the option that produces the least amount of payoff. In order to determine what the dominant strategy is for the US, we would need to take a look at the numbers on the left-hand side of each row. Therefore, the US would need to choose between -100 or 10 and 0 or 5. In this case, the US would choose 10, 0 and 5, 5, which would mean that the dominant strategy is to not use nuclear weapons. We would therefore need to do the opposite to find out what the dominant strategy is for the Soviet Union. We would need to take a look at the numbers on the right-hand side of each column. Therefore, the USSR would need to choose between -100 or 10 and 0 or 5. In this case, the USSR would choose 0, 10 and 5, 5, meaning that the dominant strategy is also to not use nuclear weapons. The cell highlighted in yellow is the strategy that both the US and the USSR have in common. This is what we call the Nash equilibrium. On the other hand, the cell highlighted in red is the strategy that produces the least amount of payoff and that none of the players have chosen. That is why we call it the dominated strategy. Next, we're going to calculate the max-min, which is when players use the strategy that maximises their own minimum payoff. To solve this game, we must first determine the dominant strategies of each player and the Nash equilibrium. Out of the dominated strategies, those that were ruled out because they produced the least amount of payoff, each player will choose their best strategy, and where they meet is the solution. If the Soviet Union looks for the best strategy out of the worst ones, which would be -100 for using nuclear weapons and 0 for not using nuclear weapons, it will choose not using nuclear weapons because 0 is better than -100. If the US looks for their best strategy out of the worst ones, which would be -100 for using nuclear weapons and 0 for not using nuclear weapons, it will choose not using nuclear weapons because 0 is better than -100. Therefore, the Nash equilibrium for the maximin would be not using nuclear weapons because it would be the strategy that maximises the minimum payoff for both players. Now we're going to calculate the minimax. To solve this game, we must first determine the dominant strategies of each player and the Nash equilibrium. Out of the dominant strategies, which were those that produced the highest amount of payoff, each player will choose their worst strategy, and where they meet is the solution. If we go back to the dominant strategies of each player, we'll see that the worst within the best for column player is not to use weapons, which is 10-0, and the worst within the best for row player is not to use weapons, which is 0-10. Also, if they end up using said strategies, we'll end up with the optimal outcome, which is 5-5, which is also the Nash equilibrium. When calculating the max, each player will simply choose their best outcome without considering the actions of the opponent. Where the strategies meet is the solution. So in other words, players choose a strategy that provides the highest payoff for themselves. To obtain the max, we must identify the highest value of the table for the player. Thus, we see that for both the USA and the USSR, it is 10, so not to use nuclear weapons. Then we obtain the equilibrium point where both players intersect, which is 5-5. In this way, we can say that the max in this game is 5-5, which is not to use nuclear weapons. Lastly, we're going to put forward our conclusions. Having observed the different strategy each player has, it isn't complex to determine that the outcome that produces the greatest payoff and involves the minimal amount of risks for both parties in this scenario is not to use weapons. The catastrophe a nuclear strike could have caused would have been too substantial. Some even speculate about the end of humanity. And given the rough economic situations that swiped most countries after World War II, the USSR, for example, would not have been able to recover from said attack. The main aim of these two superpowers during this period between 1945 and 1991 was to put up a front of facts that would intimidate the opponent. Rarely were the chances of a nuclear war possible, and when they surfaced, it is safe to say that the risks prevented it from happening. Thank you for your attention. We really hope you've enjoyed and have learnt something about game theory applied to the Cold War.